You're tuned into the podcast Sentimental Journey, where discussions happen on the music of the World War II era. My name is Hollis Zimmerman, and I will be exploring this important time in music history. Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Sentimental Journey. Today we are going to examine the events of the pre-war period. The 1930s proved to be a time of struggle and recovery for the United States after the stock market crash of 1929. In 1932, Americans elected a new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who pledged to use the power of the federal government to make Americans' lives better. Over the next 9 years, Roosevelt's New Deal created a role for government in American life. Though the New Deal alone did not end the Depression, it did provide an unprecedented safety net to millions of suffering Americans. The 1930s saw natural disasters as well as man-made ones. For most of the decade, people in the Plains states suffered through the worst drought in American history, as well as hundreds of severe dust storms or black blizzards that carried away the soil and made it all impossible to plant crops. By 1940, 2.5 million people had abandoned their farms in this dust bowl and headed west to California. The radio introduced Americans to more types of music than they had ever heard before. Radio's popularity increased due to the fact that people couldn't afford records during the Great Depression. During those years, the country enjoyed the emergence of a range of distinctly American musical sounds. Jazz was transforming big band music into a danceable swing sound. In the early 30s, swing had become its own style, played by bands that were led by artists such as Duke Ellington, James Lucifer, and Cab Calloway. Swing is distinguished primarily by a strong rhythm section, a medium to fast tempo, and the unique swing style, a combination of elongated and shortened beats, and produced by the fixed attacks and accents of the musicians. But swing didn't stop the music. Swing music grew alongside it. Dance halls and clubs were filled with jitterbugs performing the Lindy Hop, Balboa, and the Shag. The standard arrangement for the big band was a 17-piece orchestra, typically 5 saxophones, 4 trumpets, 4 trombones, and a 4-piece rhythm section. The blues seemed to reflect the mood of hardships people were experiencing during this era. It also played a role in influencing everything from boogie-woogie gospel to swing music. In addition, a form of folk music or hillbilly music originated in the Appalachian Mountains of the southeastern part of the country. What would become country and bluegrass music became popular with masses of programs like the Grand Ole Opry featuring artists such as the Carter Family and Jimmy Rogers. The oldest and longest continuing radio station in the country, WSM, began in Nashville in 1925. In 1932, the station grew a wider audience by boosting its power to 50,000 watts. On the West Coast, singing cowboys such as Gene Autry and Roy Rogers brought a new, uniquely Western sound which would develop into honky-tonk and Western swing music. In 1939, Gene Autry began hosting his own radio program called Gene Autry's Melody Ranch. Woody Guthrie, an Oklahoma native and folk singer, toured the country and wrote many songs supporting the labor union movement. Brother, Can You Spare a Dime from 1932 is the most lasting piece of music from that era. The 1930s perpetuated that nostalgic period of big bands and dance halls and jitterbugs, but few could have foreseen the shifts in popular music that would take place as the new decade and styles displaced the once reigning formats of the 1930s. One event seemed to be the final conclusive event of the decade. On April 30th, 1939, the New York World's Fair opened its doors with the theme, The World of Tomorrow. The exposition promised to look at scientific, technological, and consumer wonders never before seen. The theme song of the World's Fair was called Dawn of a New Day, a composition based on incomplete music left by George Gershwin before his untimely death in 1937. George's brother Ira Gershwin and composer Kay Swift finished George Gershwin's composition of Dawn of a New Day. This title seems perfectly symbolic of the change coming over the horizon. Unfortunately, due to the congeality of the fair would be short-lived. It seems as though it was an unofficial close to the 1930s and the music that carried Americans through the years following the Great Depression. In a few short months, on September 1st, 1939 rolled around and German troops invaded Poland, plunging the world into the most horrific conflict it has ever witnessed. England and France braced for war. Across the far Pacific, Japan had already begun its march toward Asian dominance. Irving Berlin once said, "Songs make history, and history makes songs." And indeed, the music of the early 1940s played a key role in the war effort for America. It served as a way to help boost morale, celebrate heroic wartime efforts, and even help us grapple with the extraordinary feelings of loss. By 1940, 96.2% of the northeastern American households had their own radio. Therefore, World War II was unique in that radio distributed music and information for the masses for the first time during an armed conflict. In addition, because radio use was so widespread, music became a tool of war propaganda. The American forces didn't enter into war until December 1941, until the attack on Pearl Harbor. The attack that day solidified the notion of America as a single fighting front. At stake was not only the United States' role as a military power, but also as a force for civilization. One of the most immediate responses to Japan's December attack on Pearl Harbor came from country singer Fred Rose, and his "Cowards Over Pearl Harbor" was recorded for Decca Records on December 22, 1941, by singer Denver Darling. It expresses the shock and anger felt by Americans at their sudden and undesired entry into war. The military draft proved to be an inspiration for a handful of tunes, starting off with hopeful lyrics like "I'll be back in a year, little darling," but they were soon curbed as it became obvious that U.S. involvement would last longer. Another popular theme that was in the move from civilian to military life was songs like "I'm in the Army Now." Music was used to vilify the enemy, both those in Europe and in Japan. In 1941, despite performing anti-war songs before Pearl Harbor attack, folk singer Woody Guthrie recorded "Round and Round Hitler's Grave" before enlisting himself as a merchant marine in 1942. In 1943, Walt Disney Productions created Der Fuhrer's Face, an animated propaganda short film featuring Donald Duck working a factory in Nazi Germany. The theme song, written by Oliver Wallace, became popular when the parody band Spike Jones and his City Slickers released a version of it. Anti-Japanese sentiment led to a rash of songs like "Cowards Over Pearl Harbor" and "We've Got a Job to Do on the Japs, Baby." None of these became the standards which we remember from this time, but perhaps they served as the purpose of galvanizing against the enemy or venting hurt and frustration over the attack. In the first days of World War II, the phrase "Remember Pearl Harbor" came readily to many lips, and it took little time for two songs, those words, to be released. Carson Robeson had the first, with lyrics and music by Frank Luther, in the closing days of 1941. Sammy Kaye and his band likewise recorded "Remember Pearl Harbor" in 1942, a different version that featured music by Sammy Kaye with assistance by lyricist Don Reed. Both numbers attracted country and mainstream listeners, and the two, especially Kaye's rendition, briefly established themselves as favorites for radio stations. Plus, family, community, and religious gatherings used them for group singing. Even with its initial popularity, neither version of "Remember Pearl Harbor" became the nation's war song, and both faded from the public's attention as initial fury about the Japanese attack waned. In 1942, the federal government realized that they had to control information being disseminated to the public. They even established two communities to elevate songs for morale to the general public. Since both communities were only advisory, they were unsuccessful. Even ditties that encouraged citizens to support the war effort and buy bonds were not popular successes. Having stars like Bing Crosby, Dinah Shore, or the Andrews Sisters recommended buying bonds, followed by one of their own popular songs, were more effective. Strangely enough, as the American war effort was escalating, the American Federation of Musicians instigated a strike against the major American record companies because of disagreements over royalty payments. Beginning at midnight on July 31st, 1942, no union musician could make commercial recordings for any commercial record company. That meant any union musician was allowed to participate on radio programs and no other kinds of musical entertainment, but not in a recording session. The strike did not affect musicians performing on live radio shows, in concerts, or after October 27, 1943, on special recordings made by record companies for V-disc distribution to the armed forces fighting World War II. Because V-Discs were not available to the general public, however, the union did frequently threaten to withdraw musicians from their radio network to punish individual network affiliates who are deemed unfair for violating the union's policy on recording network shows for repeat broadcast. By and large, the public rejected most overtly patriotic music and messages about how the war was progressing when it concerned their record and radio listening. Consumers much preferred the romantic ballads and up-tempo swing numbers. One hit that tied them both together being Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy of Company B. The country music genre did lend itself to a few hits that were sad stories of war, like Eddie Arnold's Did You See My Daddy Over There, or Ernest Tubbs' Soldier's Last Letter. Ballads of heartache or parting, loyalty, and love were popular immediately after the declaration of war. They included songs like I Don't Want to Walk With You, Something to Remember You By, and even a remake of Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree with Anyone Else But Me. Countless songs lamented the loneliness of separation with many men overseas. American troops had regular access to radio, but all in the most difficult combat situations, and not only did soldiers know specific songs, but specific recordings. This gave a nature to the American troops' music during World War II, not as much as songs sung around a fire or while marching, but listened to combat on Armed Forces radio. V-Disc, Stand for Victory, was a morale-boosting initiative involving the production of several series of recordings during the World War II era by special arrangement between the United States government and various private U.S. record companies. The records were produced for the use of the United States military personnel overseas. Many popular singers, big bands, and orchestras of the era recorded special V-Disc records. The V-Disc project actually began in June of 1941, 6 months before the U.S. involvement in World War II, when Captain Howard Bronson was assigned to the Army's Recreation and Welfare section as a musical advisor. Bronson suggested that the troops might appreciate a series of records featuring military band music, inspirational records that could motivate soldiers and improve morale. By 1942, the Armed Forces Radio Service sent 16-inch 33 RPM vinyl transcription discs to the troops from 8 sources: special recording sessions, concerts, recitals, radio broadcasts, film soundtracks, and commercial records. The V-Discs were an instant hit overseas. Soldiers who were tired of hearing the same old recordings were treated to new and special releases from the top musical performers of the day. The selection was very varied. It included big band hits, some swing music, classical performances from eminent symphony orchestras, jazz, and some military marches. Radio networks sent air checks and live feeds to V-Disc headquarters in New York. Some movie studios sent rehearsal feeds from the latest Hollywood motion pictures to V-Discs. Many V-Discs contain spoken word introductions by band leaders and artists, wishing good luck and prayers for the soldiers overseas and hopes for a swift and safe return. Strangely enough, a song originally written in German would become one of the most popular recordings during the war. It was composed by Norbert Schultz, who put a 1915 poem by Hans Leip to music. However, the original version was sung by Leo Anderson, sung as Das Mädchen unter der Laterne. However, it ultimately became known as Lily Marleen, as an early favorite among German and British soldiers. It was not written as propaganda and in fact was looked upon by the German Reich with great suspicion. Marlene Dietrich, a refugee from Hitler, also recorded the song in German in 1944 for the U.S. Office of Strategic Services. British Dame Vera Lynn also recorded a version for English, as well as Bing Crosby, Perry Como, and many other top artists. That's how popular the song was. World War II was indeed a defining moment in music history when ideas about national identity were consolidated both in an internal discord and internally oriented propaganda. Although the 1920s and 1930s were rife with social, racial, political tensions, the attack on Pearl Harbor pushed Americans together in a wave of patriotic fervor that swept the nation, creating a sole purpose that was shared by the government and people extended solidly to the men on the fighting front. Radio programs, presidential speeches, movies, and magazines celebrated the American way as a shining beacon of human civilization and cast U.S. involvement in the war as a noble act of defense. thrust upon a peace-loving, enlightened society by barbaric enemies abroad. Well, today we've looked at and explained how the music transitioned from the 1930s and 1940s. We have briefly looked about how Pearl Harbor and how the music focused on military life and military actions. Despite the government's hope to focus on patriotic songs, the public chose crooners and swing music. I'm Hollis Zimmerman, and I thank you so much for joining me on this first episode of Sentimental Journey as we discuss the pre-war era. And you don't forget, you can find us on social media at Sentimental Journey. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast. Stay tuned for episode 2 of the Sentimental Journey podcast.